Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 439. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to get into on today's show. I just want to give people a heads up that this morning I got a note from Twitter warning me about spam posting and that my ability to post and retweet would be impacted for 3 days. I've seen a lot of people get these notifications, and it doesn't seem to have impacted my ability to use my Twitter account. And so I'm guessing it's some kind of mistake. However, Twitter is the really way I rely on to reach my audience and interact with people, as I'm banned from Facebook. So if you are a listener of the show and you do usually find the show on Twitter, I would just recommend that you make sure you're subscribed to the show somewhere, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, or anywhere you could listen to podcasts. That way I could kind of let people know where I would end up on social media if they are preparing for a mass ban on Twitter. I have seen a lot of libertarians posting that they had these notifications, so I am somewhat concerned about that and just wanted to give people a heads up. And all right, with that, let's get into today's show. All right, and we're going to start off with some good news today. AntiWarcom receives the Sharina Journalism Award, and they posted that in giving this award, the organizers noted that anti-wars team publishes news reports, analysis, radio interviews, and videos. They are consistently reliable and accurate. From Yugoslavia in the 1990s to Ukraine today, AntiWarcom is a vital voice seeking truth and clarity in the fog of war and propaganda. And this award is named after Sharina Sim, of course, who was a journalist who was working on the ground in Turkey, exposing the West arming extremist fighters who were then entering Syria in hidden aid trucks. And in October 2014, she was likely killed in southern Turkey at the age of 29. So we are very honored at antiwar.com to have received this award. It's always cool when our work gets recognized. Of course, I'm not trying to really take credit for very much of this. Dave DeCamp and Eric Garris at antiwar.com do most of the work, and I'm sure they're also mentioning in there and including the Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, and with the good work that gets done at the site. All right, with that, let's get into the regular news portion of the show today. The first story up here is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Republican bill would affirm that NATO's Article 5 does not override Congressional War Powers. And Dave writes, on Thursday, a group of Republicans introduced a bill in the House and the Senate that would reaffirm NATO's Article 5 does not override Congressional War Powers. The effort was led by Senator Rand Paul and Rep. Chip Roy and Warren Davison. And of course, Rand Paul is the senator from Kentucky, Chip Roy is a Republican from Texas, and Davison a Republican from Ohio. Rand Paul wrote an article from in the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft promoting his bill here, and he wrote, I introduced a resolution reasserting that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty does not supersede Congress's responsibility to declare war or authorize military force before engaging in hostilities. And so this is important. We often talk about Article 5 of NATO on this show, and what Article 5 says is that an attack against one is an attack against all and requires a response. So Rand Paul points out that even in Article 5, there is some nuance to that. It doesn't necessarily mean that if Poland is attacked, the U.S. has to send, all force, strength, and might of our military to defend Poland, only that we must take action. I think the most important part of Rand Paul's argument, though, is actually Article 11 of the NATO agreement, which states that the provisions of the treaty are to be carried out in accordance with each country's respective constitutional processes. And so I think this is the important argument here. And what Rand is saying and what his bill is attempting to affirm is that no matter what happens, war doesn't get declared based on NATO. War in, you know, let's say more rockets land in a country that borders Ukraine. If that country says, "Oh, this is an attack on us," then if you're, you know, interpreting Article 5 as that means the U.S. is now at war with that country, what Rand Paul is saying that no, the Senate does get a vote on that. So I do think that's an important argument. I will say I am just slightly concerned about this legislation only because I have heard similar arguments come out of the hawkish camp, but only in a way to argue that Ukraine could be added to the NATO alliance while the war in Ukraine is still going on. And so the idea is that because Article 5, as Rand Paul says here, only requires some kind of response, well, they would argue that the support the U.S. and the West is already giving Ukraine far out exceeds the standards set by Article 5. And because of that, we could just admit Ukraine into NATO right now, and it wouldn't create this trap around the Article 5 issue that, you know, myself and a lot of other anti-war activists and people in the realist community, just, you know, people who are, you know, very knowledgeable and concerned about Ukraine joining NATO, one of the main arguments is that Article 5 could cause a major problem. So I would hope that Rand Paul's legislation gets passed and we do have this, you know, great new law that says, hey, you can't go to war without the approval of Congress, you know. But at the, you know, we in a lot of ways in America, we're already way past that. So often our previous wars, it hasn't been since World War II that Congress actually declared a war. And while we have had authorizations for use in military force, which have had varying degrees of, you know, serving as actual declarations of war, I feel like the one after 9/11 was essentially Congress giving its endorsement to wage a war in Afghanistan, where all the ways it's been used since, say Somalia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, clearly that's not what that bill was for. And so, you know, the president has been able to start a lot of wars without the approval of Congress. So hopefully this passes. If it doesn't pass, which I think is, you know, very likely the scenario here, I am concerned that, again, the Hawks will use this to try to push for Ukraine to join NATO, which it seems to be something that's more likely to me. The good, you know, news here is this does have some momentum. You know, I don't want to like down on it too much and say don't tell your congressman to support this or that we shouldn't, you know, we should oppose this or something like that. I'm just trying to be a little realistic here. But there are a bunch of co-sponsors: Dan Bishop, Troy Niels, Harriet Hagman, Paul Gosar, Andy Briggs, Andrew Clyde, Matt Rosendale, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, all Republicans. All right, so more news dealing with the U.S. before we get to some overseas stuff. So as good as the, you know, MAGA style Republicans, the American First Republicans, Matt Gaetz and others are on issues, you know, with Ukraine, they are equally terrible when it comes to issues on China. So we have this from Dave DeCam, June 22nd, AntiWar.com. Rep. Gaetz wants to give Biden military authorization to take out Chinese assets in Cuba. So not only does he seem to want to start a war with China here, but also doing it on Cuban soil would probably put the U.S. at war with Cuba as well. So Representative Gaetz on Thursday told the House Armed Services Committee that he wants to give President Biden authority to intervene militarily in Cuba to take out Chinese assets that are allegedly on the island. I support an authorization for use of military force to take out Chinese assets in Cuba, Gaetz said. He wants to add the AUMF as an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, but had to withdraw it for procedural reasons. To my Hawk friends on the committee who think I'm too much of a dove, this amendment is an authorization to use military force to President Biden to take out the Chinese assets in Cuba. And this, again, very important, that sometimes and Matt Gaetz is really good on certain issues, so I don't want to just come out and blast this guy or anything, because his opposition on Ukraine, some of the legislation that he's introduced, some of the debates that have been created around what Matt Gaetz has done has been important to at least informing even a minority of Americans about what's happening in Ukraine. However, the China stuff, he buys all the same lies from the same people that are said about Russia, that he just, they switch it to China and Beijing rather than Russia and Moscow, and then suddenly he believes it. And so Gates' comments came after the Wall Street Journal reported Beijing and Havana are negotiating to establish a joint military training facility in Cuba, which cited unnamed U.S. officials who are based the claim on convincing but fragmentary intelligence. So, in other words, the information that they have to support this claim is pretty weak. Additionally, I should mention here that Dave DeCamp, who wrote this story, who works with me at AntiWarcom, put out a tweet that Matt Gaetz responded to, really doubling down and saying that he does believe this military base is there. All right, so let's move on and start talking about the war in Ukraine. Wagner Insurrection shows weakness and fragility of Putin, and that is a statement from Stoltenberg. So I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on June 26th. The Secretary General of NATO told reporters that the Wagner Group's rebellion late last week demonstrated that Russian President Vladimir Putin's hold on power was slipping. The remarks came as U.S. officials say the threat presented by Prigozhin may be ongoing. Jens Stoltenberg, the civilian head of the North Atlantic Alliance, made the comments while attending a press conference in Lithuania. I think that we're seeing Russia over the last days demonstrate the fragility of the Russian regime, and of course it is demonstrating a demonstration of weakness. We see the weakness of the Russian regime, and it also demonstrates how difficult and dangerous it is for President Putin. On Friday, Prigozhin, the leader of the private fighting group PMC Wagner, announced that he had turned against the Russian military command and was ordering his forces to march towards Moscow. The insurrection was ended within 24 hours as the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko brokered an agreement that led to Prigozhin's exile in Minsk. The Kremlin has declared any threats from the Wagner Group mercenaries to have been resolved. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CBS News on Sunday that the insurrection showed real cracks in Putin's hold on power. It was a direct challenge to Putin's authority, so this raises profound questions. It shows real cracks. We can't speculate on how or exactly where that's going to go. We do know that Putin has a lot more to answer for in the weeks and months ahead, he said. UK Foreign Minister James Cleverly echoed his American counterpart, saying the brief uprising was an unprecedented challenge to President Putin's authority. Additionally, French President Emmanuel Macron remarked the mutiny illustrates the divisions that exist within the Russian camp and the fragility of both its military and auxiliary forces. Blinken suggested the threat to Putin may not be over. I think we're in the midst of a moving picture. We haven't seen the last act. We're watching it very closely and carefully, he said. While Blinken did not offer any evidence for the assertion, several media outlets claimed the U.S. knew Prigozhin planned to stage an insurrection weeks before it took place. And so, if the U.S. knew that, what else may they know? Liz Truss, the former UK Prime Minister and current Member of Parliament, called for NATO to assemble a plan in case Prigozhin overthrows Putin. We and our allies, including Ukrainians and the Poles, including the Baltic states, need to make sure we have a plan in case of the implosion of Russia, she said in the House of Commons. Stoltenberg argued the North Atlantic Alliance should send more weapons to Ukraine in response to Prigozhin's rebellion. It also demonstrates that it is hard to predict exactly what will happen in the next days and weeks, but we should not make mistakes that we are underestimating the Russians, he said. So we need to continue to provide support to Ukraine. That's exactly what NATO and NATO allies are doing with military support, but also support for the long term. And I've been trying to, keep an eye on this story. And of course, all these developments, there's so many layers of propaganda coming out of the Kremlin, coming out of the American media. So it's really hard to get a handle on what's happening here. But it does seem that Russia is starting to start pointing the finger at the West for this. So we have Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov saying that Western foreknowledge of the mutiny shows it was hoping that it would succeed. He says, in particular, CNN, if I remember correctly, reported that the U.S. intelligence services knew for several days that the mutiny was in the works, but decided not to disclose that information to anyone, apparently in the hopes that the mutiny would succeed. Lavrov also stated that Russia was already investigating if there was any Western involvement in the plot, while President Joe Biden issued a firm denial, saying, "We made it clear the West had nothing to do with this." Now, I also saw a report, and again, hard to confirm anything at this point, so I just want to address this because I think it's probably important for a couple of reasons, that the U.S. knew about this, and as it was ongoing, they were informing the Ukrainians to exploit this in Ukraine, but not in Russia. Basically, not to launch any cross-border attacks and try to support whatever Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were doing in Russia, but rather to just, try to take more territory in Ukraine. Now, I was kind of thinking that there would be some significant battlefield shifts because of this. I had thought a lot of troops had probably been pulled off of the front lines, but at the same time, unless the Ukrainian troops were in strategic places to exploit that immediately, it may have been hard to do. So maybe I shouldn't be so surprised by that, but it doesn't seem like there's been any major pickups by the Ukrainians because of what happened over the weekend with that. So that's about all I have on. I'm going to call it an insurrection. I'm not quite sure yet if Prigozhin had his eye on Putin in Moscow. There's still a lot of details here yet to be revealed, so I kind of hesitant to call it a coup. All right, let's move on and actually talk about what's happening on the battlefield. U.S. officials say Ukraine has lost 15% of its Bradley fighting vehicles. Ukraine has lost over 15% of the Bradley fighting vehicles that the U.S. has provided, a military official told the New York Times in an article that was published on Monday. The article detailed how Ukraine was struggling to make gains in its counteroffensive that was launched about 3 weeks ago due to heavy minefields laid by Russian forces and other stiff resistance. The report reads, "The fierce resistance has taken a toll on Ukraine's weaponry. The United States has committed 113 Bradley fighting vehicles in March, and at least 17 of them, more than 50%, have been damaged or destroyed in the fighting so far," the official said. The U.S. announced a new $325 million weapons package for Ukraine earlier this month that included 15 Bradley fighting vehicles to replace the ones that were damaged or destroyed in the first few days of the counteroffensive. Ukraine has been losing German-made Leopard tanks and is seeking more from Berlin. The Times report also quoted an unnamed senior Biden administration official who said the Ukrainian struggles and its counteroffensive have been sobering for the U.S. They're behind schedule, the official said. And that is kind of shocking that maybe it's up until this moment here that some people in the U.S. are finally realizing that this fight isn't going particularly well for Kiev. Now, I guess, they should have known, and that was sobering, is shocking, but that maybe that's why they all immediately so hard gravitated to what was going on with the Wagner Group, because it was seen as one of the only ways that Ukraine was going to make any significant advances. And, in fairness, this is why people talk about the fog of war, why it's a bad idea to take your country into war, because you really know what never is going to happen whenever you start the fighting and the bloodshed. All right, next up here. Lavrov claims that Russia is planning an attack on nuclear plant nonsense. So we're talking here about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, or the ZNPP. And Lavrov said Monday that Ukrainian allegations about Russia planning an attack on the ZNPP are utter nonsense. You know, I don't like just taking whatever Lavrov says and say, oh, well, that's true. But in this case, I do think it's very unlikely that Russia is planning an attack on this nuclear power plant. I think it would cause a lot of damage to territory that Russia hopes to make a part of Russia one day. And so while, you know, this would certainly have consequences for the rest of Ukraine, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of benefit to Russia, or actually none. You know, just there are a lot of consequences for Russia doing this. Now, this comes at a time where we have Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal introducing legislation related to potential attacks on nuclear facilities, and they want to make it so that any attack that disperses radioactive contaminants onto NATO territory would trigger NATO's Article 5, which outlines the alliance's mutual defense commitment. So interesting that this is, you know, again coming up in the Senate debate around Article 5, but the important thing here is this is something that I think is going to become a more mainstream view among the American establishment. I saw Bill Kristol tweeting this morning about wanting to put this in place as well. All right, let's move on here and talk about the F-16 training program. Denmark says starting training Ukrainian pilots on F-16. Denmark's government said that Copenhagen has started a training program for Ukrainian pilots on U.S.-made F-16s. The acting defense minister said his country has taken a step of starting a training and further education effort for the Ukrainian pilots. So I'm not quite sure if this means they're actually in the skies yet or not. I believe Dave mentioned here, yes, he added that Ukrainian pilots needed to train on F-16s for 6 to 8 months before the American jets can be provided to Kiev. And so again, we're definitely looking here at absolutely the earliest next spring, and probably later than that, that these F-16s will finally reach Ukraine. No idea how far the war is going to have escalated by then, and you know, what the relationship between the U.S. and Russia will look like at that time, but it will certainly make things worse. All right, last story on the war in Ukraine here, are, you know, NATO in general. This I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on June 26th. Germany announces troop build up on NATO's eastern flank. This is the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, announced Berlin is preparing to move thousands of troops into Lithuania. The announcement comes as Berlin and Vilnius are engaging in joint war games about 100 miles from the Russian border. And I don't mention this in the article, but when I say the Russian border, I mean Kaliningrad, which is the Russian exclave. It's sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland. On Monday, the German defense minister said that 4,000 troops will be deployed to Lithuania after facilities are built to accommodate them. Germany is ready to permanently station a robust brigade in Lithuania, he explained, while meeting with officials in Vilnius. We are talking about a brigade with 4,000 soldiers with the corresponding material, vehicles, and everything else that goes with it. And the German defense minister also met with Stoltenberg, who that story I wrote, talked about earlier in the show, was also came out of the same press conference, I believe, but definitely a part of the same kind of series of events that were being held in Lithuania in preparation for the NATO summit in that country that's about in 2 weeks at this point. So Pistorius believes that it will take several months before Lithuania has the infrastructure to support the soldiers. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who joined Pistorius in Vilnius, said that the deployment would come at a significant expense to Berlin. Lithuania's foreign minister said Vilnius hopes to expedite the process as much as possible. Lithuania has expressed concern over the Wagner Group Prigozhin's exile in Belarus, which borders Lithuania. The Lithuanian president claimed Prigozhin's presence in Minsk added to the case for NATO to deploy more forces to the Baltic states. Germany already has 1,400 troops in Lithuania. About half of those troops are on permanent deployment, while the others were sent to the country on temporary basis after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The 4,000 soldiers will be sent to Lithuania under a rotational deployment, meaning Berlin will maintain the overall presence, but the soldiers are temporary. The decision to send the forces to Berlin is seen as fulfilling a pledge made by Chancellor Olaf Scholz last year. However, there was some debate between Lithuania and Germany over where the troops would actually go, if they would go to Lithuania or they would remain in Germany and just be like on a heightened alert status, ready to go to Lithuania at a moment's notice. Beyond the troops, Lithuania is also hoping NATO members will provide additional air defense systems to the country. Pistorius explained that Berlin's decision to send the troops further east is due to the expansion of the North Atlantic Alliance. At the end of the Cold War, Germany represented NATO's eastern flank. Now several former USSR states and Warsaw Pact signatories are a part of NATO. Berlin believes that it has a responsibility to defend those nations that border Russia. And he said, "We are the ones who could always rely on our NATO partners to send us in an emergency and to stand up and fight with us. Now Poland and the Baltic countries are particularly exposed. We, as the Federal Republic of Germany, explicitly acknowledge our responsibility and obligation as a NATO member state, as the largest economy in Europe, to stand up for the protection of the eastern flank." The announcement of troop deployment came as Berlin and Vilnius are engaging in joint war games about 100 miles from the Russian border. Germany sent 300 tanks and 1,000 soldiers to Lithuania for the military exercises. All right, now let's move on. We got a couple stories about China here, catch up on from the past week. Blinken bats Biden, calling Xi a dictator. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Sunday defended President Biden, calling Chinese President Xi a dictator. Biden referred to Xi as a dictator just one day after Blinken met with the Chinese leader as a part of a trip to Beijing to smooth relations. China was furious over Biden's remarks and lodged a formal complaint with the U.S. ambassador in Beijing. "When it comes to China, we are going to do and say the things that they don't like," Blinken said on CNN's State of the Nation when asked if Biden was wrong to call Xi a dictator. Blinken said China would also continue to do and say things we don't like, pointing to the rhetoric from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. At daily press briefings, representatives of the Chinese Foreign Ministry often harshly criticize U.S. policy towards China, but avoid personal insults directed at President Biden. When asked if he believes Xi is a dictator, Blinken responded, "The president speaks clearly, he speaks candidly. I have worked for him for more than 20 years, and he speaks for all of us." During Blinken's trip to Beijing, the two sides agreed to maintain dialogue, but no breakthroughs were made, as the Biden administration is not changing course on major issues of concern for China, such as increasing support for Taiwan. So I think this is really, really important. And it may, in some ways, this incident here where we have the CIA director William Burns acting, I believe, pretty much as Biden's personal diplomat, going to China, setting the stage, making it possible for Blinken to then make a trip to China where he has public high-level meetings with Xi, with the Chinese foreign minister. This is portrayed by the Biden administration as a chance to have a diplomatic breakthrough and to de-escalate tensions. However, I think China was really looking at to see how the U.S. behaved in this meeting, and was far less optimistic about it prior to the meeting and after the meeting. But then Biden personally insulting Xi so quickly after it happened, I think is going to be extremely damaging to the relationship between Washington and Beijing, at least so long as Biden is the president. We have Blinken as our Secretary of State. And so this is disturbing, I guess, that the Americans are so inept. The White House is so inept at addressing China's concerns and understanding, how China feels about how serious these claims are and things like that are interpreted in China is very disappointing, and makes me think that we're in for several rounds of escalation to come. So this next one, Taiwanese analyst to join U.S.-Japan Taiwan Strait war games, is likely going to be something that infuriates Beijing as well. Taiwanese military experts will join the U.S. and Japanese analysts in conducting war game simulations for a potential conflict with China in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Morning Post reported. This wasn't the 26th, but the Monday before, the June 19th. It will mark the first time that Taiwanese analysts join the tabletop exercises, demonstrating the increasing participation for the war in the region. The event will be hosted in Tokyo by the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, a semi-official think tank. This is the first time experts from Taiwan will work with their U.S. and Japanese counterparts on tabletop simulations, a senior analyst for the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, a government think tank in Taiwan, said. The war games will simulate a conflict with China's People Liberation Army on one side, known as the Red Team, and the U.S., Taiwan, Japan on the other side, known as the Blue Team. And so I imagine this, again, going to be seen as highly provocative by China and likely to escalate tensions further, as well as the actual actions the U.S. is going to be taking in the region. I wrote this 2 weeks ago, and it's been a while since we talked about China on the show. My apologies, just with all the Port Fest stuff going on and how much news there has been on the war in Ukraine. This has kind of fallen by the side, but I do want to mention that the U.S. Coast Guard plans to expand operations in waters claimed by China, and I think we're seeing some of that in effect already. I wrote that on June 13th, and then Dave DeCamp wrote this on June 22nd. U.S. Coast Guard cutter makes rare Taiwan Strait transit. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter made a rare solo transit through the Taiwan Strait on June 20th, which came a day after Secretary of State Antony Blinken concluded his 2-day visit to Beijing. The U.S. frequently sends ships through the Taiwan Strait, but the U.S. Navy warships typically make the transits. U.S. Coast Guard cutters have sailed through the sensitive waterway in recent years, but are usually accompanied by a Navy ship. And so this, seems significant to me. And I have to imagine that some people in China feel like this is the Americans basically asserting that the Pacific Ocean is nothing more than an American lake. U.S. aircraft carrier commander reports very professional interactions with China. And so I just want to note this, that while we do focus on the tensions and the escalations, all the times that a U.S. warplane is flying just a few miles off of China's coast and a Chinese plane intercepts that, and then the U.S. talks about unprofessional intercept, we do have the commander of the USS Nimitz saying that the Chinese vessels that were in the region where he was were very polite and professional. So a little bit of a different narrative coming out of the Pentagon on China than we usually hear. Just wanted to note that. And then I just want to run through these, I think 4 articles here real quick. These are all countries that surround China, and just listen quickly to some of the military escalations we're talking about here. June 15th, U.S. military gets unimpeded access in Papua New Guinea under New Deal. The U.S. military has gained unimpeded access to sites in Papua New Guinea under a new military pact Secretary of State Antony Blinken signed in the Pacific nation last month. This is June 15th. U.S.-India working to boost military cooperation. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan discussed boosting military ties with India during a visit to the country. This was 2 weeks ago to prepare for Indian President Modi's first official state visit to the U.S., which just happened yesterday. Then this June 21st, U.S. nuclear-capable B-52 bombers arrive in Indonesia for the first time. And one more, U.S. aircraft carrier makes rare port call in Vietnam, and that is June 25th. All those articles are written up by Dave DeCamp, and you could read them in full at AntiWar.com if you want to read all the details of those. But I think, just reading the headlines really goes to show the general trend of what's going on and why China views the American policy as so provocative. And of course, again, with Biden condemning Xi the way he did as a dictator, I am concerned that the Biden administration may have really botched their chance to develop a relationship with Beijing on somewhat sustainable grounds. And the series of escalations that we're going to see this summer and fall are going to be very serious and move us much, much closer to war with Taiwan. I think what the White House would see as like a Ukraine-like scenario, not war with Taiwan, war with China over Taiwan. And that is certainly the direction the White House seems to want to move. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. Again, make sure you're subscribed somewhere from the show, just in case, even if I get kicked off of Twitter for a couple days, can't post for a couple days, that means I can't post the show there. So make sure you're listening to the show somewhere. And again, if I do get like a permanent ban, then I would be able to use the show to communicate to everyone where to find me in the future. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with another show on Thursday or Friday.